Hello and welcome to Scripture in Context. My name is Katya, and I am here to teach you about the language, culture, and history of the Bible. In the last video, we talked about the first part of the actual parable of the Good Samaritan, and we learned about the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, about the priests and the Levites, and about ritual purity. If you haven't seen the previous two videos yet, then check out the links in the description below. In this final part of our series, we will talk about who were the Samaritans, about the actions of the Samaritan in the parable, and about the challenging message that Jesus wanted to send to his listeners through this parable. The person who showed up on the scene next was not who the listeners expected. They might have thought that a regular Israelite, or maybe even a Pharisee, would come along and do the right thing. But like he often did, Jesus preferred to make a point by stirring his audience. So a Samaritan showed up, happened upon the injured man, and stopped to offer him help. Why was it such a big deal that the man was a Samaritan? And who exactly were the Samaritans anyway? When the northern kingdom of Israel, and its capital Samaria, was destroyed by the Assyrian Empire in the 7th century BCE, a great number of the Israelite population was deported to other parts of the empire, while other ethnic groups were brought over in their place. Those foreigners intermarried with the remaining local population and began to follow a religion which was a combination of paganism and worship of the God of Israel. Almost 2 centuries later, after their return from the Babylonian exile, the Judahites, now called Judeans or Jews, began to rebuild the Jerusalem temple, which had been destroyed by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar almost 50 years earlier. The Samaritans came down and offered to help rebuild the temple, but their offer was rejected by the Jews on account of their mixed blood origins, so they began opposing the building project. The Samaritans ended up building their own temple on Mount Gerizim during the time of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE, and argued with the Jews that that was the correct location for worship and not the temple in Jerusalem. The tension between Jews and Samaritans continued to escalate. In 128 BCE, the Hasmonean king John Hyrcanus conquered the province of Samaria and destroyed the temple on Mount Gerizim. During the time of Herod the Great, one of whose wives was a Samaritan, there was temporary peace, which we can see from the fact that the Samaritans were allowed in the inner court of the Jerusalem temple. This peace ended, however, when one Passover, between 6 and 9 CE, a group of Samaritans entered the temple during the night and scattered human bones under the porches and all over the sanctuary. Whether this was done as an act of retaliation or not, the defilement undoubtedly caused great trouble during the feast, and as a result, the Samaritans were banned from re-entering the Jerusalem temple. By the time of Jesus, hostility had continued to grow more and more. When 1st century Galilean Jews traveled to Jerusalem, especially for the festivals, and they journeyed through Samaria, they were often mistreated, and on occasion there was even bloodshed. Josephus tells the story of a particular event in 52 CE, when one or more Galilean Jewish pilgrims were killed by Samaritans on their way to Jerusalem. In retaliation, Jewish rebels rose up and killed a number of Samaritan men, women, and children, and plundered and burned down their villages. The Roman procurator captured the attackers, and many of them were killed. During the 1st century, due to the prejudice against their origins, the Jews began to refute all Samaritan claims of having a relation by blood to Judaism, even though the Samaritans recognized the Torah and observed it piously. As a result, the Samaritans came to be regarded on the same level as Gentiles in all religious and ritual matters. Going back to our parable, we can now see the effect Jesus' words would have had on his listeners. When he spoke about the appearance of the Samaritan on the scene, no one expected any good to come out of it. To their astonishment, however, it was the Samaritan, their bitter enemy, who had compassion toward the injured man. Since the Samaritans also followed the Torah, the Samaritan man would also have been faced with the inconvenience of ritual impurity in case the man on the road was dead. Unlike the priest and the Levite, however, he was moved by the pain of the stranger and not only decided to help, but also to take on a high risk for his own personal safety. On the one hand, the robbers could have still been around. What is more, someone might have seen him and blamed him for attacking what was probably a Jewish man. We saw how that could have turned out. Yet, despite everything, the Samaritan drew close and took care of the man's wounds. He used olive oil to soothe his pain and wine to disinfect the wounds. Then he put the man up on his animal and took him to an inn to continue his care for him there. The actions of the Samaritan echo another Bible story. At one time, when the northern kingdom of Israel had defeated the southern kingdom of Judah, the Israelites took a number of Judahite men captives. The prophet Oded, however, spoke against their actions. So under the influence of a few Israelites, the captive Judahites were released. Clothes were provided to those who were naked, also sandals, food and drink, and oil to rub on their skin. The ones who couldn't walk were put on donkeys, and then all of them were taken back to Jericho, while the Israelites returned to their capital, the city of Samaria. The parallels between the two stories are too obvious to have been missed by Jesus' audience. Was he trying to remind his listeners to learn from the past and bury the hatchet? The Samaritan paid the innkeeper 2 denarii to care for the injured man. The price of a day's board would have been about 1/12 of a denarius. 1 denarius was the cost of a full day's wage. This means that the Samaritan not only seriously overpaid the innkeeper to be completely sure that the injured man would receive the best care possible for several days, but he promised that he would cover any possible additional cost on his return journey to assure the man's care for as long as was needed. After he finished his parable, Jesus asked the Torah scholar, "Which of these 3 men acted like a neighbor?" The learned man readily identified the man who had acted with compassion. Then Jesus commanded him to go and do likewise. Let's back up a moment. Jesus did not really answer the question of the Torah scholar, "Who is my neighbor whom I should treat with love?" Jesus could have focused his attention on the unknown injured man and simply said, "Anyone in need is your neighbor." But then, why did he bother to bring in the Samaritan into the story? On the one hand, it could have been to point out that even a lowly Samaritan, who was similar to the Sadducees in his approach to the law, placed a higher value on human life than the Jewish religious leaders who were more preoccupied with keeping their religious purity. But there is more. With his final words, Jesus not only answered the Torah scholar's question, but he went further than that. With his almost rhetorical question, he clearly established the fact that the Samaritan man, the bitterly despised enemy, had acted as an example of what it means to act like a neighbor. This included, first, who do you treat as a neighbor when you're being neighborly? And second, how do you treat that person as a neighbor? Who did the Samaritan treat as his neighbor? Not only someone in need, but someone who was almost surely one of his enemies, and who probably would not have done him the same service if the situation was reversed. How did the Samaritan treat that man? He disregarded his own comfort and even his safety and went above and beyond to not only alleviate the man's immediate need, but also to continue helping him for as long as was needed. Together we have seen that the parable of the Good Samaritan is not just a pleasant story about a random traveler who did a good deed. It is an attack against social, racial, and religious bias. It teaches us that even the hatred of our enemies should not prevail over our desire and duty to treat them in a loving way, and that we should go above and beyond what is expected of us when someone, even our enemy, is in need. If you wish to study the parable of the Good Samaritan on your own, in a group, or maybe with your students, then you should consider purchasing my study notes, in which I share all of my sources and provide extra footnotes with additional information. At the moment, my website is under construction and the purchase option is not yet available, but as soon as it is up and running, I will post a link to all study materials in the description down below. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this video series, then please share it with your friends and family. And if the parable of the Good Samaritan and its message have spoken to you personally, then please share your story in the comments below. I would love to hear it. Until next time.